Good afternoon. We're very pleased this afternoon to have with us Admiral Leighton Smith, who is NATO's Allied Forces Commander in Southern Europe and also the I-4 Commander in Bosnia. He's here to give you an update on how the mission is going. Following that briefing, we have the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs, Dr. Steve Joseph, to provide you an update on the clinical evaluation program that we've had underway for quite some time now. And both Admiral Smith and Dr. Joseph will be happy to answer your questions after their preliminary remarks. Admiral Smith.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I've got a whole lot to add to what General Jowen briefed you all on some time back, but let me just try to bring you up to date. There are a couple of things that are going on today. One, you will obviously know that the International Tribunal is doing some work up in Srebrenica, and the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Armored Division under Colonel John Batiste is up there providing the standard support package that we have been offering and would offer to ICTY and others. You probably know already that essentially relates to area security. That is to say that we would give them a good briefing on any information we might have on minefields, any information we may have on a populace up there that would be hostile to them. We obviously know where the forces are, and frankly we don't have a problem with the forces. The military side of this thing, the entire peace agreement and peace implementation process is frankly going very well. So that has not been a problem. With the teams, we have been able to place what we call liaison teams. Their principal concern is to make sure that we have constant communications and contact with these teams that are in there, and then of course their response capabilities in the event that they are required. So intelligence data on the area that they'll be working. Obviously they would be interested in minefields and what kind of minefields it might be up there. Liaison teams, we have been able to provide some logistic support in terms of they sleep in our encampments, so that gives them a place to go at night, and I suspect if they're real hungry they can eat MREs, but let me tell you, you got to be hungry to eat those things. I really found out why I joined the Navy after I had my first MRE. We see good evidence that there will be compliance at the D+120. You will know that that basically involves moving forces into cantonment areas. There have been some difficulties, quite honestly, in numbers. We continue to see discrepancies in the total numbers that they say they have. For instance, we got a call yesterday by the HVO that we found some air defense systems that we didn't know we had, and we're going to put them in this collection center. Well, my guess is that they figured we would find them, so they fessed up to having them. I mean, I can't imagine that an Army would have something like air defense systems that they wouldn't know about. And we found some weapons in the zones of separation and other places. Those are, I don't think, serious violations. They are violations which take our time and frankly detract from our ability to perhaps do other things. Let me tell you that there are a couple of unsung heroes in this whole operation, aside from the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine, the young men and women, not only of this country, but about 33 other nations that are doing a bang-up job on the ground and frankly, a somewhat complex environment. But we've got an internal information campaign system. We call it the IIC. In our country, we used to refer to that as a PSYOPs program. We've gone to a great deal of effort to ensure that the people in Bosnia know what we're about. And we have, as an example, 4 radio stations. We buy time on about 14 or 15 other radio stations, so we can reach 95% of the population over there and do. We publish a weekly newspaper. We had initially started out with 60,000 copies, and we would go distribute that, and frankly we had some problem distributing that. We now are up to 100,000 because they have been requested, and not only that, when we go to a town to distribute them, the people come out to get them, and that's good news. What do we print in the newspaper? We will reprint a lot of the things that you all put in your newspapers and what you put on your television screens and radio. because the people in that country are starved for news, and we like to provide for them what we can. We do that on our radio station as well. So the IIC, I think, is doing very well. In addition to putting news out, this group of individuals will publish pamphlets, flyers on mine awareness and mine safety. We've published things like the poster on war criminals. We've published soldiers' cards that give them the requirements that we have in terms of detaining war criminals. We have published cards for the soldiers on our policy with respect to police checkpoints. Those things will also be made available to Ambassador Bob Froelich in his efforts with respect to the elections. And we have also used them to support Carl Bildt and his organization in putting out information such as the Sarajevo Transition Plan. I know that General Jalwin talked to you about our CIMIC under Brigadier General Tom Matthews. Talk about an unsung hero with about 400 people in Bosnia, double handful in Croatia and other places. They have made a tremendous difference. They are completely integrated into the High Representative's office throughout all of the committee structures. We, CIMIC, have regional offices where Carl Bildt's organization has not yet gotten out of Sarajevo into the regions, principally, I think, because of funding. I'm not complaining or criticizing. What I'm trying to tell you is that we've planted the seed corn out there. We've got an organization that he can fall in on top of, and we've offered him support in terms of office space, administrative support, communication support, and obviously the contacts with those people that we've run up against. Some of the concerns that I have, well, let me just add one other thing here. The Deputy Com-I-4, French Lieutenant General Jean Heinrich, has been essentially acting for me as our direct contact with the civilian organizations at the higher level. He works with Carl Bildt and Jacques Covey and Mike Steiner. Aside from that work, Jean has put together what we call an airport transition plan. I was briefed on this the other day. We think that one of the key elements in getting Bosnia back on its feet will be the opening up of the airports. And we've got a pretty ambitious program laid out that we say it's ambitious because we know it's going to be expensive. But what our people have done, I say our people, military, have gone around to the 4 airfields, Sarajevo, Banja Luka, Tuzla, and Mostar, and laid out precisely what is required to make those functional airfields for commercial air traffic. We are, of course, controlling the air coming in now. We are controlling the airfields, and those 4 are in use. The civilians are very interested, and I've just written a letter to Prime Minister Muradovic last week saying that you're cleared to bring commercial air into Sarajevo and into Banja Luka, which are the 2 places that he asked for, as well as to Tuzla. We just need to work out the modalities. But the airfields are, I think that's going to be a long-term problem, and it's going to be very expensive, but we have laid out the requirements. Some of the concerns that I have, frankly, coming online are the return of the displaced persons and refugees. There's an awful lot of them out there, roughly 2.4 million that are in the country, and then I'd say something less than 2 million in the country and another 700,000 to 800,000 outside of the country. The UNHCR has got a plan to resettle these, and of course an awful lot of that resettlement is going to be dependent on whether or not we can open the roads, and we're doing pretty good at that, frankly. First step is mobility. Let's make sure that they're trafficable. The second step is psychological. There's not much I can do about that because people are afraid to go from, frankly, one entity to the other right now. But we do have mobility, roughly 80 to 85% now, and the rest we're working on. The election's coming up. Bob Froelich has done a dynamite job, and I think he would be the first one to sit here and tell you that he's got a lot of hurdles to go through, but he's working that, and we're working with Bob very closely. In fact, I mentioned to you General Heinrich. He has a weekly meeting with Bob Froelich's people, the OSCE, ICRC, UNHCR, ICTY, World Bank, and our objective is at the highest level in Com-I-4 is to show our interest in our support to them, again, within the limits of our capabilities and on a not to interfere basis. The A very difficult problem, frankly, that we see right now is the police. The International Police Task Force is roughly 38% manned, and we are, 105 or 6 days into this mission. I personally believe that even if they get everybody, they're not going to have enough, and they're not getting them fast enough. I've talked with Peter Fitzgerald. We work very closely together. Commissioner Fitzgerald is a great Irish cop, and he's a wonderful man, and he works for Iqbal Risa, who is the UN mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So we work with them, and we have done so, as you may have recalled, during the transition in Sarajevo, which was rather difficult. A real sore spot is the prisoner issue. It should be unconditional. That is to say, we continue to hear stories that the Serbs would release theirs, if the Croats would release theirs, if the Muslims would release theirs. You go back and read the Annex 1, there are no conditions to release. It's not an exchange. It is the release of prisoners, and we continue to push that point home. And I think that it's terrible that the people of that country continue to barter with people. The folks that have been in prison long enough, they're being treated like large pieces of meat, and it's time that they were released without condition. And we have called on them to do that virtually every time that I've ever talked to the presidents or the prime minister. On the civil aspects, I'm proud to tell you that there's an awful lot of things that have been going on, and this was part of our plan at the very beginning. We knew the importance of the civilian construction projects. Our engineers have been a vital part of the entire built organization in terms of providing data that we have developed in our surveys of the road systems, the telecommunication systems, the power systems, the water systems. Those kinds of things are important. We know that. Some of the work we can do ourselves. Some of the work we can merely point out, this needs to be done, and we can even help try to scope it out. We're involved in engineering tasks, mine clearance, medical, supply, transportation, resources such as having our mechanics either teach repairmen or repair ambulances, fire engines, those kinds of things that are pretty critical to the local communities. Local contracts. We want to try to maximize the number of local contracts that we can sign so that we generate employment amongst the community where our forces might be. And finally, I mentioned to you the telecommunications systems in our attempt to try to help identify problems that can be fixed, find the places where the lines have been cut or blown out, try to help them reinstall if we can. Some of it's just finger work, splicing wires. We are involved in that as much as we can to the degree that the individual commanders on the ground do not believe that that work is interfering with their primary mission. Now let me just finish up by telling you that these right here, that represents about 1,000 kilometers of former confrontation line. Now you will know, because General Jalwin told you, that 2 kilometers either side of that has to be free of all weapons. 10 kilometers either side of that, any weapons in that area have to be declared so we know where they are, and we go visit those and inspect them. That's like leaving here and driving to Charleston, South Carolina, and trying to make sure that 6 miles either side of Highway 95 is clear of weapons, or that if they're there, you know precisely where they are, except transfer that to mountainous terrain where there are no roads and people who don't always tell you the truth, and you got yourself a problem. So this is not an insignificant problem, just the maintenance of this kind of thing. The second part of this equation is, this map doesn't have it on there, but there are darn sight lot of roads in this country, a lot of roads. And on every single one of those roads, you will find police checkpoints, because that is the way that those people have lived for years. And I put out an edict, a policy statement about 3 weeks ago that complemented that one developed by Peter Fitzgerald. And what it said was, we will not tolerate police checkpoints that are there solely for the purpose of restricting the movement of the population. That is to say, if they're only stopping cars with license plates that are either Croatian or Muslim or Serb, they will be taken down. Checkpoints have to be established under the guidance and auspices of the International Police Task Force. If they are not, they get shut down. Last week we shut down, in just M&D North, up here, we shut down 30 checkpoints. Of those, 14 were Bosniak, 6 were Croatian, and 10 were Republic of Srpska. We have as much restriction on movement inside the Federation as we do outside the Federation. Yesterday we shut down a total of 4. There were 2 others that we understand were there, and we're investigating those. I'm not sure that I can say much more except that in the grand scheme of things, I would tell you that we have been very pleased with the military implementation. I kind of think that our successes, as I told Art and some others at a defense breakfast one morning, I lay it to the 3 R's. We went in there with a robust force, and we advertised it as such, a capable force, well-disciplined, well-led, well-equipped, and well-trained. We have the right rules of engagement, and we told everybody what those were in general terms, and we have resolve, and they know that. And that's one of the reasons why our implementation process has been pretty good. We've also been even-handed across the board. I'm not liked by anybody over there anymore. Now, may I take your question? Yes, sir.
Admiral Smith, what do you see as a solution to the prisoner issue?
Well, Carl Bildt has recommended in Moscow that if the prisoners are not released, they would postpone the donors conference, which was to be held or is to be held, I think, later this month. It's not clear. That's clearly up to Carl Bildt and the people who are in the political realm. But I believe that that the pressures from the political side and the economic side are the proper way to deal with the prisoner issue. It is a political issue. I-4 is, let me go back and say that the prisoner release issue is contained in Annex 1, but it is an international committee of the Red Cross, and we basically help them by providing logistics and using our Joint Military Commission as a forum for making sure that the data is exchanged, and we would then go and provide security while they exchange them. I don't think that military force to enforce a prisoner release is probably something that I would jump in the middle of right now. I would tell you that that while we were doing the prisoner release discussions during the very first Joint Military Commission, the parties or the representatives, which were the military, would go back and telephone their politicians. And I'll tell you where it was coming exactly right from the top. I've talked to Krajisnik about this. I've talked to both Muratovich and to Izetbegovic and to Ganic about this personally. I've talked to President Milosevic about this. He agrees with me, by the way, that we should release him. And I've talked to President Zubak and to President Tudjman. Personally, I've seen these people on this prisoner release issue. And I know a lot of other people have as well. I mean, I'm just telling you that I'm just one of many. And we haven't broken it free yet. There was a big breakthrough last weekend, I guess it was weekend before last, when the Bosniaks released 109. Actually, they released 110. They just didn't tell you about the other one. Yes, sir.
Admiral, two-part question, which is usually half of what I ask, but anyway.
Make it short. I got a short brain.
I'll come back at you again. Over the past 100 days, how often, I don't mean in totaling up the number, but how often have the I-4 forces had to go eyeball to eyeball with the former combatants and removing roadblocks and what have you? And the second part, and you may want to cover it at the same time, do you get any indications from the former combatants, either in force or in rogue elements, of an impending spring offensive?
Let me answer your second one first. No. We're going to break this spring offensive cycle. That's what General Jalwin calls it. Let me tell you why I believe that to be true. We are seeing the forces, one, demobilized. We are seeing the forces brought into cantonment areas. We are seeing concentrations of weapon systems. And let me tell you, we'll know if they start getting antsy, they'll start moving those weapon systems, and that's a major tipper. But we're watching it. We know where their weapons are, and we check them very, very closely. So I don't think there's going to be a spring offensive. I don't think there's going to be any kind of force-on-force against I-4. We didn't expect it when we went in, and we don't expect it now. And the reason it won't be is because they don't want to tangle with us, and that's just a simple fact of life. I'm not trying to be a tough guy. I'm just telling you that's a fact of life. The first question was, how many times have we gone eyeball to eyeball? Does it happen? It does happen. It has happened, well, I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. The day one or day two, excuse me, the Brits were going up. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. I'll come over here. Yeah. All right. I don't like hiding behind the podium. I want you to get a clear shot at me. Up in this area, the Brits on about day one decided to go on up into Serb territory. Hadn't been done before. A couple of guys on a checkpoint said, nope, sorry, you can't come through. They said, fine. They made a quick call. A couple of warrior tanks over the hill. You know, all that patriotism evaporated like that. We had, just to make sure we even-handed, there's an airfield up here at, I want to say Visoka. About a 3,000-foot strip. A couple of the French forces wanted to go in and take a look around. Again, a couple of guys at the gate said no. Next day, 100 French soldiers, 2 tanks, and a few armored vehicles. No problem. It turns out that they were the only 2 guys there, so no wonder they let us in. But just to make sure that we got their attention, we got a letter of protest, by the way, and it came to me from the Prime Minister, and it says, we don't appreciate, you're not an occupying force, and you can't do that. So just to prove to him I could, I took a helicopter and landed at the damn thing the next day, and that really made it, you know, got his attention. I wanted to go to Armaska up here. That's, you know, that detention camp up there. What a horrible, horrible place that is. Anyway, John Shattuck wanted to go up there, and I told John I'd take him. So we went. I sent what we call an advance team up there the day before I arrived. They got to the gate. Armaska is now housing a battalion of Serb soldiers. We had 2 of my guys and an interpreter. They went up to the gate. The 2 guards at the gate were immediately joined by about another 10 or 12. And through my interpreter, my guys were said, no way you're coming in this place. And the guy said, well, you need to understand Admiral Smith's coming back tomorrow. I'm not going to tell you what they said, but they don't love me up there. I mean, this is not a big love-in. The next day, we landed our helicopters in a field about 8 kilometers away. The Canadians met me with 21 armored personnel carriers and all the force we needed. And the Sergeant Major, who was driving my APC, as we got to the gate, he looked around and he says, well, Admiral, wonder of wonders, the gate just went up. And we went in. John Batiste down at Hans Pijak wanted to inspect a weapons storage area. He'd been denied 2 times. The 3rd time he went back, he was denied entry. He informed the Serb guard there that he was going in one way or the other. Now, the easy way was let him walk in. The other way was that he had this place covered with artillery to include multiple launch rocket systems, plus Cobra helicopters, plus 35 fixed-wing aircraft overhead. Now, do you have any questions? And the gate came up. On police checkpoints, we have had to consistently knock those down. Sometimes they're easy, sometimes they're not so easy, but really nobody argues with us. Once they see that we're determined, they understand that they are going to lose if they try to take us on. We may go up to a place and be refused entry, but 1 hour later, that guy's going to see a force he's never seen before. And it has never failed. We've never been told no more than about once or twice in a particular place.
Follow up here, when you said no sign of force on force, but what about rogue elements? And going back to what you just described, and it's very forceful, looking back, would you say that if the UN had had the horsepower to do what you're doing, that much of what has happened in the former Yugoslavia could have been prevented over the past couple of years?
Boy, I'd really be going out on a limb if I said that. I will tell you this. I worked with General de la Prelle when he was the commander of the UN forces there in Zagreb. I know of no finer officer. He is currently the senior military advisor to Carl Bildt, and Bertrand de la Prelle I consider to be a close friend now. I think he was in an impossible situation. He had a peacekeeping force when it was a war-being force. I got a war-fighting force and it was a peace-doing force. So we just got our things backwards. I think if he'd had the force I had and the ROE that I've got, we may have been able to avoid this thing sometime back. But boy, that's way out on that limb. Yes, ma'am.
On the war crimes issue,
Yeah.
Is the provision of general area security sufficient for guaranteeing the integrity of the sites?
Tammy, I think so. Here's the situation. There are probably upwards of 300 mass grave sites over there. I can't tell you how many because I don't really know. And a mass grave site is defined as anything with about 3 or more. And we've decided that we have 8. We have called those the big 8, and we think in those 8, Lubia, Ormashka, Srebrenica, and obviously 5 others, we think there's upwards of 30,000 people potentially buried in these sites. There are other sites that the International Tribunal have expressed an interest in. There are sites that we know of that we obviously want to keep an eye on. And we're working with the intelligence organizations. We have road patrols that keep an eye on them. The fact is, I do believe that we can, in fact, we will know if someone decides to tamper with those. There is a report from the Christian Science Monitor reporter who was captured back in October, I think, as he was investigating some war crimes, that there may have been some tampering with a gravesite near Zvornik. I found out about this morning. Obviously, one of the things we'll do is we'll start taking some pretty good pictures of that site to see, but you know, the question I've got to ask myself is that this place has been under snow for quite some time, and if the reporter who hasn't been back there since October, you know, how does he know, and what's his information? We got a single source that there may have been some tampering. I look at it this way. I've been to several of these mass grave sites. It is not a pretty thing to stand on top of a piece of ground where you think there may be 1,200 people buried, and look right there, and there's one of them that hasn't been buried. I mean, the body was out there, fully clothed, obviously decomposed. Anyone that tampers or tries to tamper with a site like that, or the Omarska site, which is what they call a sludge lake, in which the bodies were dumped because they wouldn't float back up to the top, or the Lubia site, which is a strip mine, which is the largest iron ore mine in Europe, and it is 10 kilometers long and probably 5 kilometers across. If somebody wants to tamper with those sites, it's going to take a tremendous size force, and we will know that pretty quickly. I mean, a few people going to exhume a body or two, I can't do much about that, but we're watching them with reconnaissance. We'll respond by telling the ICTY, if they want us to, we'll guard the site until such time as they come and guard it. But we haven't seen any evidence of that. Yes, sir. You're next.
Well, following up on that, Admiral, what David Rode of Christian Science Monitor says, and our cameras were with him when he went there today, to Sahanitsi, is that there's substantial evidence of tampering there, that there's substantial evidence of large-scale earth-moving equipment having been used on both of the burial areas on both sides of the road in that area. When I was in the Srebrenica area with John Shattuck in January, he said, as you've said today, that these sites were going to be monitored. They would be watched. Would you, if intelligence has evidence of tampering, would you know about it today? Has there been tampering of those
intelligence,
sites?
I guarantee you I'd have known about it because I was at the CIA this morning. If they knew it, I would know it.
And you do not know of any
No.
evidence of tampering at Sahanitsi?
Not at that site, no. And I'm not aware of any evidence at other sites. Now, obviously that does not mean that it did not occur. And I'm not certain in my mind as to the visitation on those sites. We've got, as I said, there are some 300 sites there, and we're obviously not looking at all of them. And I frankly would have to go back and look at the data. I'm thankful that John has gone and looked at that, and we'll take whatever information he's got, and we'll act on that with the ICTY.
What I'm asking you is, well, first of all, is it a war crime to tamper with a mass grave site?
I believe that I'm not qualified to answer that question. I would tell you, though, that it seems to me if tampering with evidence, it has some association with the crime. Even, I mean, if they're trying to destroy the evidence, there would be some association with that. But I'm not qualified to give you an answer on it. I will tell you this: I'm frankly surprised. Again, I would have to look at the evidence that he's got in the area that he's got it. This thing is near a dam. There's plowed ground around this field. The place that I went up here the other day with, up in this area with Ambassador Albright, that is a field where they plant wheat. So they have earth movers up there that are moving dirt, but they're not digging up bodies. And I mean, I was there, so I can tell you that. Let me get other questions, but I can't. I mean, that's most I could say about that right now.
If I just ask one more thing. Can the U.S. detect earth-moving equipment that is being used at night?
Yes.
Admiral, on the end of the mission, is it your expectation come December that I-4 will be able to leave in its entirety, and do you expect that to be your recommendation? You know that's one of the hot questions.
Well, I knew that question was going to come up, and I've been trying to figure out how I was going to answer it. You asked it a little bit different. That's not fair. You're supposed to answer the question the way I expect it to be answered. Not the way my canned answer, which I've written down right here. No, that's not true. You obviously know that that is a tremendously excitable issue right now. Let me tell you where we stand on it, and I'll give you the honest-to-God opinion that I can. First of all, there are three elements to this peace process: the military, the political, and the civil. The military is going pretty darn well. The civil and the political, civil's coming online. I'm pleased with some of the things I see. We'll try to help them and continue to help them as much as we can. The political side, there have been some recent initiatives on the part of the Croatians and the Bosniaks with respect to the Federation. We welcome that, but there's an enormously difficult task ahead for them. And I think what we have to do is to continue to evaluate those three, if you will, pillars to this peace implementation process. The real trick is whether or not a military force is going to be required on scene to keep the other military at bay, because that's really what we ought to be doing, is to keep the militaries apart so the parties can continue to develop confidence between themselves, that they can go about building what I call transforming a situation where we have an absence of war into a situation where we have a lasting peace. Right now, I'm not prepared to make that recommendation, and I think we will be as we go along. Obviously, there are some people that are. Prime Minister Maratovich has made it quite clear that he thinks that a very formidable force should be there after I-4 departs. There are some people in Europe who have expressed an opinion both for and against an I-4 remaining after December. I will just tell you that the smart man would go look at the situation, judge it at the time, make a decision, and then from that point on be guided accordingly. I told you I'd call on you next, and you're next.
Briefly follow up, is it your feeling from talking to allied, senior allied officials, that if the U.S. made a decision that its portion of I-4 would pull out, would that pull the plug from the whole thing, or can you see a construct where I-4, some portion of I-4 could remain with U.S. support, but not necessarily troops on the ground?
I have personally not done any planning on this. Let me make this straight. You got that camera running? I have not done any planning on this. I see that there's a potential for both scenarios. I've read in the papers that we all came in together, we're all going to go out together. I have seen some countries individually state that on 20 December we're going to be out of there, period, no questions asked. That is not, by the way, the United States. I have seen others that if the U.S. goes, we go. There have still been others that this is a European problem, we got to get our act together and get in there and do it. You can virtually get any combination of force you want to. The only thing I ask is, look, let's take a realistic look at the environment, and if I'm the force commander, tell me what it is you want the force to do, and I'll tell you the size of the force, and then let's get on with the problem. But I think it's a little bit early right now to be talking about that. One of the things we are doing is we are doing what I call a reshaping of the force drill. There are going to be rotations this summer. This was part of the plan. So what we want to do is make sure that we put our bid in for what kind of forces we want when the rotation's made. We came in heavy. We wanted to come in here. We wanted to come in there as mean as a junkyard dog, and we did. This summer, however, I think we need to lighten that force, not lessen capability necessarily in terms of the missions that I see before us, but lighten it in the sense that we're highly mobile, can get around the country. And that's where we are right now. We are also developing a model. The model would tell us how long it'll take us to get out. So that if somebody asks me a month from now, and if you ask me now, I ain't going to tell you, but if somebody asks me a month from now, okay, Smith, how long is it going to take you to get out once I say go? That model will hopefully have all of the data in it, and that includes all of the equipment that's been brought in, all of the stuff that was there before we got there, all of the environmental cleanup we'll have to do when we leave, that sort of stuff. Tell me how long it'll take to get out, and I'll be able to give them a pretty good guesstimate so that if I do have a drop-dead date when I got to be out, I can give them a pretty good idea how long it's going to take. That's what we are doing right now.
Sure, I understand that your answer, when you said right now I'm not prepared to make that recommendation, meaning right now you would not recommend that
No.
we pull out at the end of the year no matter what.
I didn't say that. I'm not prepared to make any recommendation about stay or go right now. I think there are too many variables in this plan, and I would prefer, frankly, to not be quoted as saying one way or the other. I'm prepared to wait and watch the development. We've got time before we have to make that decision. From a military perspective, we got plenty of time. And I'm just I'll give the political bodies that control my destiny the advice that I think is correct, and I'll give it to them before I give it to you. All right? Yes, sir.
Admiral, do you agree with General Hughes, the new DIA director's assessment of the situation in Bosnia at this point in time? And secondly, have you received the report on the alleged rape of the female Army officer by 2 Czech soldiers, and what's the status of that?
Give me your first question again.
The new DIA director's assessment on sort of the Bosnia House of Cards issue.
I talked to General Hughes this morning. He and I agree that the situation right now in Bosnia is I guess a good word to put is fluid. I would not put the twist on it that he was quoted as having said in the paper. I think what he said was that there would be a requirement that once I-4 left that things would get sort of nasty and people would be fighting at each other. That came out in one piece of paper, and believe me, where I live most of my life nowadays, you can read anything you want to in the papers. But so I don't really know what he said precisely, but I think we would agree that we do have a situation that at best what we want to be able to do is to keep the military apart, and if we can do that without a large force or without a force in there, that's really the goal. I am not convinced in my mind that pulling out is going to be an automatic result or automatically result in a lot of people fighting again. I'm not prepared to make that kind of a judgment right now. I just don't think that's the way it is. Excuse me just a minute.
And the rape question? The rape question?
The rape question. I have not received any substantive report on that. I have seen some of the reporting. You may or may not know. That went in U.S. channels right away, and the U.S. Army Europe is handling the investigation of that incident. So I'm not prepared to comment on it. What I have read was a piece of paper. It was an interim report, and it would be just totally irresponsible of me to talk about that here because I'm just not qualified. Right here, I'll get you 4 real quick, and I'll answer them short.
All right. Admiral, what problems do you see are coming because the police force isn't up to speed, and is that going to play a role in your decision to recommend?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because I should have said something about it. I think the police forces over there really are in trouble in terms of their professional capabilities and their attitude up here, and that's what I banged on their heads pretty hard in Moscow with respect to what I call the lack of professionalism on the part of the police forces and the lack of the political direction. I've sent a second letter and personally visited the 3 prime ministers and a couple of the presidents to talk about the conduct of their police forces, which I find to be less than acceptable. I think Commissioner Fitzgerald would agree with that. If they don't get their act together, that is going to be a serious problem for the resettlement of the refugees. It is going to be a serious problem for the elections, and it's going to be an even more serious problem because one of the major issues on the horizon is crime. Every country that's gone through what this country is going through has suffered an enormous criminal problem post. In other words, and we see the development of that now. I can tell you right now, I'm very concerned about that element, and the police are part of it, not part of the crime, but their professionalism will help prevent the crime. Right now, they're an impediment to movement in that country. The police forces are. The Prime Minister, Maratovich, asked me if I would knock down his police checkpoints. I said, wait a minute, that don't make any sense to me. Where is your instruction to them to dismantle? President Zubak had to write 2 or 3 letters to one customs checkpoint to get it knocked down because they were trying to charge us money, I-4, to come into the country. I said, wait a minute. The president of my country, man, he has just to think something, and man, I'm going to react. Yes, sir, 3 bags full. 3 letters for one checkpoint? No. Over here. Wait a minute. One behind you.
Admiral, you said that you've got some time to make a decision about recommending stay or go. Can you give some idea of the things you'll look at when it comes time to make that decision? That is just the military part of the mission?
Well, I believe that if you really, I think the elections are going to be key, and I think the atmosphere that is sort of prevalent up to and at the election time is going to tell us an awful lot. If we start seeing an atmosphere or an environment that's sort of free of threat, in other words, if a politician can go forward, give a speech, and want to be elected without getting shot, Yeah, that's pretty good indicator. If freedom of movement, those kinds of things. I don't think we're going to see an integrated society by then. I just don't think that's going to be in the cards. There are going to be obviously places where there'll be intermixed, but generally I would say we should not bank on a fully integrated society living happily together ever after. That is not something that I think is going to happen in a year. But there are going to be other indicators. One, of course, is some of it's just going to be what I call gut feeling. How are these guys getting along? What do they look like when they sit at the JMCs together? Are they still glaring at each other angrily? Do they stomp out of the room and slam the door? Do they sit for hours and hours and finally reach an agreement and then 20 minutes later tell somebody that agreement is no longer valid? Those kinds of things happen now, and I think that's what we're going to be looking for. Yes, sir.
You talked about rotating in lighter forces later on summer. Do you have any particular forces in mind, and are any of those U.S.-based?
The answer to that question is we have some particular kinds of forces in mind. Again, the highly mobile forces. I'm kind of partial to MPs because I think a lot of our forces, a lot of our work this summer is going to be in terms of crowd control, traffic, getting people out, patrol, and that sort of thing. I like air mobile. I like lighter forces on the ground. But again, I'm not the ground commander. General Sir Michael Walker is, and he's very good at what he does. Thank you very much. And I'm going to let him make that decision. I have made some inputs to him. We have discussed it, and there's been an awful lot of very smart people work it. But I think my personal view is lighter, mobile, so we can get around to more parts of the country. We had one final question back here. Yes, sir.
Does that mean the first AD will be rotating out?
No, sir, it doesn't mean that at all. Because I don't know what the U.S. policy, the U.S. policy that I heard was that first AD would not rotate out.
They'd be there for the duration?
I'm sorry?
That they would be there for the duration?
That's what I had been told, yes, sir. Now, it's not clear to me that the whole thing's got to stay there. In other words, there may be pieces of it that rotate out and others of it come back in. I would tell you that let's let the ground commanders decide what they want. Bill Nash is up there doing a dynamite job. Bill Nash knows his area of responsibility much better than I do. He probably knows all the roads and all the hills and all the valleys and all the dales. And all I know is that he's up here somewhere in this sector, and that's a pretty big problem. I'd rather let him decide what he needs, and then he'll tell me, and I'll go forward to SHAPE or to General Jawa, and I'll ask him to go out to the countries wherever they might be and whoever they might be, and give them our requests. I really appreciate your interest. Believe me, the one thing, if you don't do anything else today, take away the message that the young men and women that represent this country, whether they be Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marine, are representing you and the rest of your countrymen in a way that would make you just extraordinarily proud. And some of them are not living very pretty, but I haven't seen them stop smiling. I go up there and it just makes me feel good to be around them. And thank you very much for interest.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we have a 10-minute silent period before the next briefing?
What's the general feeling? Do you want a short filing break? Looks like you're outvoted, Ivan. Dr. Joseph.